Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report podcast. I'm your host, Vago Muradian. Our podcast is brought to you by Bell. Since 1935, Bell has been redefining flight. Learn more about its pioneering spirit at bellflight.com. And joining us now is Greg Poling, the director of the Asia Maritime Transparency Institute at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Greg, thanks very much for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
And before we get started, a quick shout out to all of our sponsors. Leonardo DRS sponsors our global coverage. Northrop Grumman sponsors our weekly cyber report and broader cyber coverage. Fincantieri Marinette Marine sponsors our naval coverage. Elbit Systems of America is our trade show sponsor. And Bell, of course, is sponsoring this podcast. Greg, there have been some news reports of a standoff between China as well as a Malaysian drill ship in the South China Sea. But this has been an ongoing episode, and the latest in a series of episodes that China has precipitated as it tries to make good its maritime claims across the South China Sea. This is actually sort of a five-way standoff. It's Malaysia, Vietnam, and China. The United States and Australia are involved. The USS America and an Australian warship are in pre-planned exercises about 50 miles away from where this incident is taking place. And this incident it started in December. Walk us through what happened, what's at stake, and what each of the parties here have been doing over the past 5 months or so.
So this is part of a long-term strategy in Beijing to make it all but impossible for any of the other claimants to operate, at least for their civilians to operate. The oil and gas sector is where this is really heating up over the last 2 years or so. The completion of artificial island bases in the Spratly Islands is allowing China to keep Coast Guard ships and militia ships out off the coast of its neighbors 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in a way that's entirely new. And so that allows China to keep this constant pressure on the parties in a way that makes it far too risky and far too expensive for commercial operators to do their jobs. The latest example of this is now in Malaysia. So Petronas, the state-owned Malaysian oil company, started drilling exploratory wells in two areas out in its extended continental shelf, which is actually an area also claimed by Vietnam, but Vietnam's claim is at least within the framework of international law. China's is not. China responds, as it has repeatedly over the last couple of years to multiple states, by sending its Coast Guard down. And what the Coast Guard's been doing for the last 5 months has been getting in the way. Mostly it's harassing the civilian supply boats that come back and forth from the Malaysian coast, bringing supplies, rotating personnel, etc. Cut across their bow, circles them, gets dangerously close, anything they can do to create a risk of collision, hoping that eventually the Malaysians will back off. That hasn't worked. They did the exact same thing to Vietnam last year in the case of a Russian operation. That also didn't work. And so in both these cases, what we've seen China do is escalate horizontally. China sends its own survey boat into Malaysian waters, just as it did to Vietnam last year. And that survey ship is now operating basically to tell the Malaysians, okay, not only are these our waters, but we're going to prove it because you can't do anything to stop us. Now, that survey ship got there a few days ago, over the weekend, and by, I suppose, good timing, the USS America and its escorts were joining up with an Australian vessel to do what we assume is a pre-planned exercise, and they've decided to swerve a little closer to the Malaysian coast than they probably planned to before.
And they're about 50 miles away from where this sort of standoff has been going on.
Best we can tell, there's a commercial satellite shot of the America within about 50 nautical miles. Maybe they've come closer since then. I don't know. Certainly they are close enough that they're picking up the chatter from these Malaysian boats and the Chinese boats, and also the couple of Vietnamese boats. As I mentioned, this is also claimed by Vietnam, and they've got some of their own militia boats out there, basically fishing boats that are actually working for the state. I think what the goal is for the USS America, for the Aussies, they don't actually plan to physically do anything out there. They're just letting the Chinese know that they're watching. And so if Beijing goes a little too far, gets a little too aggressive, it now knows that the world will know about it immediately. That might have some deterrent effect here. It's certainly not enough to keep the Malaysians in this, though. My guess is that Malaysia, just as Vietnam did last year, will stick it out until they're done their exploratory drilling. They probably have about a month left. At least that's how long they have on the lease for this drilling ship. And then they'll go home and say, we finished our job, but they'll never come back. They'll never try to produce from these wells.
So let's delve a little bit deeper into several very interesting elements of this. One is how the Chinese Coast Guard, the Haijing is one of the ships that's involved. I love the fact the Chinese do the same thing the Soviets used to do, which is just arbitrarily change hull numbers on the same ship to keep sort of everybody confused and guessing. I love that. Talk to us about how the Chinese Coast Guard is playing a role in this, and how Chinese fishing boats are playing a role in this, because that's something that's a feature both as well for how, as you mentioned, Vietnam is doing this with its militia ships as well, which is sort of a murky area for a lot of people, right? I mean, people understand sort of Coast Guard, maritime law enforcement, navies. Now with these sort of deputized militias, that's sort of another confusing element. Talk to us about how China in particular is using these forces, and then actually how others in the region are using them as well.
Sure. So it's really three naval forces that China has out there. Their Coast Guard operates as part of the military, so does their militia. The People's Liberation Army Navy is actually the least important part of this, at least when it comes to the day-to-day operations. There are at least a dozen, and usually more, Chinese Coast Guard ships in the southern part of the South China Sea, patrolling around Malaysian waters, Vietnamese waters, Indonesian waters, day in and day out. Their job is to go out and just assert rights and harass the neighbors from time to time. And when a big dispute erupts like this over this oil and gas operation, you get half a dozen or a dozen Coast Guard ships that get sent out. And keep in mind, when you're talking about the Chinese Coast Guard, you're talking about ships that in many cases are larger and better armed than the navies of all the neighbors. Some of these are former PLAN ships that still have 76 millimeter cannons on the deck. Some of them weigh 4,000, 6,000, 10,000 tons.
Well, they have a
So they're pretty
14,000. They have a 14,000-ton Coast Guard ship as well.
So the largest ships they have are, well, estimated around 12,000. They've got
Okay.
a couple of those, but they mostly save those for the Japanese. They do, however,
They
deploy them in
save
the
them
South.
for
Yeah,
that's part of our
they
Japanese
save them
thing.
for the Japanese in the
Yeah.
East China Sea, but they do deploy them when they really want to send a message. And one of those seems to be now. One of the 12,000 tonners was sent down to the Malaysian coast. Last fall, it was sent off the Vietnamese coast. Now, the Coast Guard is, the big intimidating guys, but they actually hang back a little bit in most cases. The primary actors, the tip of the spear, are the maritime militia. And these are, I'm not using that as a term of art. The Chinese military service law requires that all healthy men, when they leave the service, they go into the militia. Most of them do it on land, but some of them do it at sea. And so there is an entire corps of militiamen who serve some full time. They never fish a day in their lives. They just have a fishing boat with no fishing gear on it. They trade in one uniform for the other, and they go out and serve under the direct orders of either the Coast Guard or the Navy, doing these kinds of operations, getting in the way, causing risks of collision. These are the guys who cut across the bow of U.S. surface ships doing fawn ops. They're the ones who, blow their horns and fire water cannons, whatever, at the Southeast Asians. And their goal is to create the risk of a collision, but with a degree of deniability. Because if the other state decides to treat them as an armed combatant, which they are, China can turn around and say, you just attacked unarmed fishermen. These were civilians. Of course, they got a little too aggressive, but they were still civilians. And so that really complicates the responses from everybody, U.S. included.
I want to go back to something you mentioned a moment ago, which is that the Malaysians will go through with this to claim that they finished, but then never go back to that drill site, which means effectively China wins. If you look at it, Indonesia also backed off of territorial claims recently, concluding that it just was not worth the trouble. And in part, that's the entire Chinese strategy. How does the region deal with this? Because by drips and drabs, the Chinese are turning this into are turning it, 10 years ago, we said that this was a fanciful dream and that they'd never be able to do it. I remember being at the Shangri-La Dialogue when the first bag of cement was dropped off on one of those features and nobody believed the Chinese were going to do anything. Where are we going, and how does the international community deal with this?
Yeah, that's right. There was a gross misunderstanding of what these bases were going to be used for, right? Which is their primary goal is peacetime coercion. Now, we can have a whole different podcast about what they mean in conflict, but China doesn't want to fight that conflict. China wants to be able to project so much power with its Coast Guard and its militia in peacetime that all of its neighbors decide the fight's not worth having. And it looks like that's going to work, right? In a few years, if this trajectory is maintained, the South China Sea will effectively be a Chinese lake. The US Navy will keep doing FONOPs through it, but that's not going to help the Filipinos or the Malaysians or the Indonesians at all. And China's strategy is to, without fighting, create prohibitive risk for the neighbors, right? Make it so that no rational oil and gas company would be willing to invest in a Malaysian oil and gas block or a Vietnamese oil and gas block. Make it so that no rational fisherman would be willing to operate in the South China Sea because of the risk of getting rammed and sunk by a Chinese boat. And they're getting close to that. Now, to their credit, what we've seen from the neighbors over the last 6 months is a willingness to stand up when China kind of touches the third rails in their system. From Malaysia, that's Petronas. So they are now in the middle of a 5-month deployment of their Navy to keep this rig operating. The Vietnamese did it for 4 months last year, where they had about 50 boats deployed at one point protecting an oil rig and trying to stop a Chinese survey. The Indonesian president flew out to their frontline island at Tuna Besar to send a signal. But this is a war of attrition, and China will win. China has more boats. China can keep them out there longer. The Malaysians cannot possibly do this every time they want to drill. And that's the point. China will let you have the win on that day, but they'll be back in 3 months, and you can't keep up with this level of deployments.
So what does everybody do about it? And if nobody does anything, what does that effectively mean as well?
Part of the solution here is the military capacity building, the presence operations by the U.S., all the stuff we've been doing. The problem is that those are necessary but insufficient, and we've basically left it to the Pentagon to solve a problem that isn't military in nature. The solutions are going to be diplomatic and economic. China has to be convinced that it can have the South China Sea, or it can have a seat as a global leader, but it can't have both. And if you effectively isolated the Chinese, imposed economic costs, treated them the way we treated Russia for its support for paramilitaries in eastern Ukraine, you might bend the calculus of Chinese leaders toward compromise. Because what they want most of all is to be seen as a global leader. You can't be a global leader if you're seen as a rogue state. But so far, we've been unable or unwilling to rally that kind of international support. We were close, late 2015, early 2016. You really had the international community, or at least most of it, singing from the same songbook on this, but that dissipated. You need to get back there. You need to talk about sanctioning bad actors here. All of that, all the things that the naval strategy is buying you the time to do. But, like I said, this is a war of attrition, and China will eventually win. All of the FONOPs and presence ops and capacity building in the world, all they do is push back that date of China's victory a little bit. They buy you a little more time. The diplomats need to do their job in that time, and that's what's not happened.
And for those folks, Greg, who may not know, how many islands, artificial islands, have the Chinese built, and what is the military capability or the broader capabilities that exist on these islands, given that the reason China did that is, as you said, to create this sort of air and maritime identification zone to sort of exert control over the entire South China Sea?
So China built 7 islands out of nothing in the Spratlys. They already have 20 in the Paracels farther north, which are really just a problem for Vietnam, and they've made those bigger. Across all of this, China's built a network of resilient, redundant ISR capabilities, radar, communications, intelligence collection. They see everything that moves on or above the South China Sea. They've put 3 air bases down in the Spratlys, so they have air dominance. The US doesn't have any ground-based aircraft closer than Guam and Okinawa. So if there's ever fighting, the Chinese are going to control the air. The Chinese have them well defended, anti-ship and anti-air missile platforms, plus a whole lot of point defenses. So these are pretty hardened. And what they ensure is that, could the US neutralize the islands? Sure. Would it be wildly expensive? Would you have to fire every bit of ordnance you have in your stockpiles in Asia? Probably, which pretty much guarantees that you don't do that. that if there's ever a fight with the Chinese, the U.S. cedes the South China Sea, at least in the opening stages of that fight.
What more should the last administration have done? Um, it's not that there was no activity. The question was, well, wait a minute, the Vietnamese and other people are doing this as well, right? I mean, so there was a lot of relativism that played into this discussion at the time. What is it
Yeah.
the last administration, but as you said, they were sort of marshaling to get ready to do something, and then, their term ended. So what more should the last administration have done? What more should this administration have been doing for the last 3 years
Hmm.
to try to change the vector and to change the dynamic?
To be clear, this is not a Trump administration problem. It's not an Obama administration problem. This is a U.S. problem over multiple administrations. Under the Obama administration, you did have senior officials in state and DOD who at least seemed to understand why the South China Sea was important. You'd have kind of the right speeches, and they did, at key moments, take steps that were important. They prevented China building on another feature of Scarborough Shoal, for instance. They helped the Filipinos break a blockade of one of their bases in 2014. But those were few and far between. Mostly, the pattern of the Obama administration was they understood why it mattered. They talked a big game, but they were unwilling to put skin in the game when it counted. Because, especially in the second term, when Kerry took over as Sec State, the South China Sea became subservient to bigger global priorities. They wanted Chinese cooperation on Paris climate deal. They wanted on Iran, on North Korea, etc. And there was always a fear that if they listened to the hawks and did more, China would refuse to cooperate in other areas. That was the big problem. Now, under the Trump team, that's in some ways been flipped. You have a willingness to upset the Chinese. We'll piss them off for any reason. It doesn't matter. But it doesn't seem that there's any clarity on why any of this matters. It's hard to imagine going into the Oval Office and saying, we need a concerted interagency process to defend international law and our allies in the South China Sea. Both of those words are allergic to this administration. So the only way this would work is if you could combine those two, right? If you could get somebody who was actually willing to upset the Chinese and who understand when it's worth picking that fight.
Well, right. I mean, that's the biggest criticism of the administration, is that on the one hand, its strategists truly understood in the early part of the administration the strategic competition between the United States and China, whereas the rhetoric coming from the boss did not match, or hasn't matched, the aspiration of the strategy at the end of the day. China has been, go ahead.
Well, I was going to, and for 2 years, we basically didn't have a State Department. At least not at a level that could stand up in the interagency process and do anything. And so in a problem like this, the default was Jim Mattis ran South China Sea policy. But Jim Mattis can't be your Secretary of Defense and your Secretary of State at the same time.
Let me ask you how the coronavirus plays into this, and how the escalation of both Chinese nationalism and rhetoric could manifest itself, and xenophobia, I might add, may manifest itself going forward in the region, especially as they have internal economic challenges that are going to that coronavirus has caused and will be exacerbated by global depression.
So the storyline in the regional press over the last couple of weeks is becoming China takes advantage of coronavirus to act more aggressive in the South China Sea. I think that's half right. I mean, as I said, a lot of the activity we've seen over the last months is really no different than what China was doing 6 months ago. So it's not, it's much more straight line than I think some of the coverage is giving it credit. But it is fair to say they're taking advantage. If there was ever a time when you would have expected China to take its boot off its neighbor's neck, it would be now, when they're struggling with a pandemic that is partially China's fault. And so the fact that they're continuing business as usual is really stirring outrage in the region. Now, whether or not that lasts is an open question. It's not as if Hanoi and Manila and Jakarta haven't been outraged before. We'll have to see if it can be sustained. It is clear that leaders in Washington who want to talk about this, especially in state now under Pompeo, that they see a window of strategic opportunity. So state has put out multiple statements over the last several weeks. Pompeo just raised this in a teleconference with ASEAN leaders that was supposed to be all about coronavirus, and put a whole section of it, South China Sea, you should be mad at China. We'll see if that works. I think there is a possibility that coming out of this the the veneer of diplomacy that China's been using for the last 3 years at least, saying that, oh, if the Americans would just butt out, we can peacefully solve the South China Sea, that maybe that'll be completely ripped off finally. But I'm not willing to put down those bets yet. ASEAN has not exactly had a spine on this for a while.
But does it potentially get worse? Indonesia and China have been going back and forth on fishing rights for a long time. Where are we on that? Is this an Indonesian victory and a Chinese defeat? If not, why not? What does it mean at the end of the day?
No, I think it's much the same as you see in the case of oil and gas rights in the Malaysian context or the Vietnamese context. And Vietnam also has its own fights with China over fishing rights. The Indonesians won a battle, but they're going to lose the war. They deployed their Coast Guard, their Navy. Eventually, they sent fighter jets for some reason to send a signal. And President Choi himself personally intervened, got on the phone with Xi Jinping and said, you need to stop this. And the Chinese backed down. But then they came back 2 weeks later. They'll always come back 2 weeks later. And at the end of the day, if your strategy, as Indonesia's is to play whack-a-mole, the Chinese have a lot more boats than you do. For every Chinese fisherman you drive off, there's 100 you didn't. And eventually, they will be in de facto control of your fishing grounds by sheer weight of numbers.
So we all know how this ends, unfortunately.
We all know how this is going to end if something doesn't change. I'm not so cynical as to keep doing this if I thought it was game over. I'm willing to say that we are losing. And by we, I mean the international community, not the United States. The international community is losing the South China Sea. It is not lost yet.
So what is the next administration, whether it's a continuation of the Trump administration or if it's Biden administration, what needs to happen from day one? And what does a concerted strategy look like?
So this is going to be a long-term effort. Let's be clear about that. Nothing gets solved in 1 year, probably one administration. But if I was going to set out a list of 3 priorities, as soon as you get it in, 1, fix the Philippine alliance. You need, in a post-Duterte Philippines, you need to get the Visiting Forces Agreement back. You need to get U.S. forces rotating through bases in the Philippines through the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement that the Obama administration signed in 2014. All of the things that the U.S. Army and U.S. Marine Corps Pacific want to do with getting long-range fire teams along the first island chain, all of that happens in the Philippines. Without the Philippines, none of that happens. It's all a pipe dream. So you can't have deterrence without saving the U.S.-Philippine alliance. Number 2, put the South China Sea back on the top of your diplomatic agenda. When you go to meetings, not just in Asia, but when you go to the G20, when you're at the G7, the South China Sea should be at the top of that agenda. Because if it isn't, all this administration has done is talk about North Korea and trade fights, and it sends a message to the Chinese that we don't really care that much. And it also sends a message to everybody else. That's why the Europeans refuse to talk about the South China Sea anymore, because there's nobody in Washington asking them to. So if you want to diplomatically isolate the Chinese, you have to treat them the same way you do the Iranians or the Russians or the North Koreans, like a rogue actor on this topic. Number 3, you need to have an interagency process dictated by the White House that says, look at every way you can to pressure the Chinese on this, including economic. Treasury should be having a real discussion about how you box bad actors in China out of international financial markets, out of the U.S. market. Right now, Chinese companies who are illegally building in the South China Sea or who are supporting paramilitaries are free to invest in U.S. and allied ports. That's insane. So, the big takeaway is treat them the exact same way you did Russian entities who supported paramilitaries in the Donbass, who were very quickly targeted for sanctions.
Greg, thanks so much for joining us. Really, really appreciate it. Look forward to having you back on again on what is an incredibly important topic that folks don't spend as much time thinking about as perhaps they should.
Hey, thanks a lot for having me. I look forward to the next opportunity.
And thanks for joining us. Please follow our daily interviews with top government, military, industry, and thought leaders at Defense and Aerospace Report, and subscribe to our weekly newsletter. Follow us on Twitter at DEFAERO Report. That's at DEFAERO Report. Like us on Facebook at Defense and Aerospace Report, and check us out on LinkedIn. And check out our weekly Cyber Report sponsored by Northrop Grumman. For more than 80 years, Bell has pushed past the boundaries of what's possible to drive aviation forward, going above and beyond flight, bellflight.com. Thanks again to Bell for their generous sponsorship, and we'll see you again tomorrow.